Capital is abundant. Understanding is scarce. The Dynamo Show goes deep with the new industrialists rejuvenating industry and commerce. Brought to you by Dynamo Ventures. Learn more at dynamo.vc/podcast. Now, here's your host, Madelyn O'Farrell.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the Dynamo Show. I'm your host, Madelyn O'Farrell, and I'm excited to be joined today by Erik Olson. Erik, thanks so much for being here.
So glad to be here. Excited for the conversation.
Before we dive into the world of the regulated energy market, could you tell us a little bit about your journey and the work that you do today?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I've essentially worked at the intersection of technology and policy in the energy space my entire career. I got an engineering degree from Utah State University in mechanical engineering, developed kind of a pet interest in clean energy and climate change and nuclear energy specifically. And that was kind of my dive into the wonderful world of energy. So between, over the course of my career, I've worked in think tanks, thinking about how we can kind of like generate the next generation of ideas for energy policy, at the state and federal level. I've worked in consultancy, and currently I'm at Current Energy Group, consulting clients who operate in the regulated utility space. And before that, I was at the U.S. Department of Energy, where I was essentially like a program manager, helping the department run innovative programming. So like I've mentioned, I've bounced around a lot, and it's given me an interesting perspective on energy policy.
Amazing. And from your seat advising folks in the regulated utility space, how would you characterize the demand surge we're seeing around energy? From your seat at the table, is there something about this moment in time that maybe folks who aren't in the room don't appreciate?
Sure. Great question. I think we are in the midst of a generational change in kind of the energy system. If you've been kind of paying attention to this space or listening to others kind of talk about this isn't just my words or my ideas, but we haven't really seen demand growth like this on the electricity side since the 1970s and really the advent of air conditioning in the United States. It's really, really unprecedented. That's scrambling a lot of what we normally talk about and debate in terms of energy policy. And I think it's really like scrambling a lot of the typical coalitions you're seeing politically. It's scrambling kind of like where you go to seek energy expertise and kind of how people navigate through the energy ecosystem. And I think in real time, you're seeing a lot of the hyperscalers really kind of start snatching up a lot of people with really great energy expertise and the AI companies themselves, because they realize how important energy is as an enabler to all these kind of like wonderful tech fantasies and realities that we're seeing kind of in modern day. So I think, to your question of like, what don't they understand, what they don't appreciate, I think is that there's a collision right now in terms of what businesses and what companies are asking from the grid and kind of from the energy system that was designed when things were moving a lot slower. Energy policy used to be kind of boring, kind of like sleepy and slow. And I think we're kind of rapidly seeing that change in real time. And I think we're seeing kind of the tension between people who want to move really fast, meeting institutions, some of whom were developed in like the 1920s or 1930s, literally when the grid was like first being built out in the United States. I think it's easy to forget that tension. And I think it's easy to forget both like how complex the grid is as a machine, as an entity in the United States, and how the institutions that are built to kind of manage it and make sure it stays well run, effective, all that kind of stuff. How those institutions necessarily have a conservatism and then a little C conservatism of moving slowly, making sure we're not breaking things, which is kind of ironic given the kind of tech slogan we all are used to hearing, move fast and break things. That's fine if you're talking about an app. It's not so much if you're talking about the grid.
I love the point on the grid being so different today or the use cases that it needs to be designed for today relative to the way it functioned when it was first designed. The parallel that I've heard thrown around is the US grid system is similar to the highway system before we put in the highways, and that it's fragmented, disconnected, poorly maintained. It's not well suited to a lot of this bidirectional energy uses that we want it to do today. On that point around kind of that demand surge, we're seeing massive load requests come onto the grid today, 100 megawatt data center campus, for example. How does that differ from what utilities have actually planned for? What are some of the headaches that they experience in trying to tackle these new types of projects?
Yeah, sure. Great question. And I think even beyond like 100 megawatt, I mean, you're starting to see like gigawatt scale data centers go into place. And it's like the utility system and kind of regulators who, operate the grid outside of utilities, make sure the utilities are operating it effectively. They have worked in a very particular way for a very long time. So I'll use the example of like, let's say a manufacturing plant is added in the community. It's not the first time that data centers are not the first time large loads have had to be integrated into the grid. The difference is though, is that urgency, that speed, I think I was mentioning earlier, a manufacturing plant, though I'm sure they wanted to get that in, quickly, there's not the same pressure to do it right now or yesterday as we're seeing kind of with hyperscalers. And so I think normally how this would work in like normal times is you'd have one county getting one big manufacturing plant. They would go to the utility and say, hey, we're going to connect. Here's the heads up. Here's all the paperwork. Give us 2 years or 3 years, and then we'll kind of get you all the grid equipment to, get what you need to interconnect. They let the regulators know, they do the modeling, they kind of incorporate it into the system. Boom, we're on our way. There we go. The problem is now we're having dozens of those manufacturing plants, so to speak, come online quickly and want to do so now. And I think like I was mentioning earlier, the way we study the grid, the way we model it, was designed to be slower. And now that utilities haven't necessarily been planning for a lot of this growth, I want to be careful what I say here. I think that there's wide expectations and wide kind of a wide array of assumptions that different utilities are making to try and plan for this growth. To put it kind of bluntly, you see kind of crazy assumptions of load growth, in 20, 30-year timeframes in IRP proceedings, integrated resource plan proceedings. And you see some that are slightly more conservative and I think are not as aggressively planning for load growth or kind of not to the same degree of load growth. And I think where this really gets complicated is as data centers are saying, hey, we may put in a data center in Texas, let's say, as business changes, as chip design changes, the amount of power and the amount of kind of stuff they're requesting from the grid may change too. And so what you have is you say, there's kind of this frothiness of like, hey, we're going to put in 100 data centers in Texas by 2030. Then as you get closer to 2030, say, maybe it's only 70. You know what? Maybe it's only actually 30. And so you have this kind of wild swing between assumptions of like what people are saying they're going to do in 5-10 years and then what's actually getting built out. And I think that what's actually getting built out is a lot harder to project, though we are getting better at it. And I think the big risk, the big kind of challenge for grid modelers, utilities, and so on, is that who pays for that, first of all? Second of all, do you run the risk of things like stranded assets or overbuilding? You can imagine, let's say in a place like Texas, a power plant gets built to serve this expected data center demand, but then that doesn't pan out. Who's on the hook for paying for that power plant? It's a different question in every state, in every grid region, in every RTO, ISO. How that all works varies a ton. And so I think these are a lot of the debates you're seeing right now in certain states where they're saying data centers, whatever kind of grid infrastructure you're saying you need, we're going to design rates as such or kind of ask for payment terms that means that can't get put on the shoulders of ratepayers, of people who, people like you and me who just have an AC and some lights and things like that in our home. And I think that's really the big debate that we're seeing right now is like, how much should we do that? How much do we want to do that? And then the kind of political tensions that emerge naturally. Because again, it's like a generational shift. We haven't really had to deal with this. And all the people who have been kind of at the command helm of doing this may not have seen this or may not have been like, in their careers yet. So
I want to pull on that thread around the geographic element here. As you mentioned, a lot of the energy policy and the way utilities work is very state by state. And then on the flip side of that, where the demand is operating is kind of state by state. We have these data center clusters, the most obvious being in kind of Northern Virginia, that are also impacting how this plays out. And so from your perspective, where do you see the demand being most acute, where these data centers are being built? And then where do you think there are parts of the country that are closest to kind of hitting their ceiling in terms of energy infrastructure to meet that incoming demand?
it's a great question. And I think it's shifting a lot by the day. So you're seeing like different, from what I understand. So I've not worked directly with like data center developers or kind of, with utilities necessarily having to manage this. But I have worked around this space a lot and seen kind of some of the debates in the various states. It depends on what the priorities of those states are and kind of what the limiting factor is for a given geography. So the example you're hearing a lot in the Intermountain West is water. If a data center is using a ton of water, has the perception of using a ton of water, that's what regulators and I think folks are going to be most keenly paying attention to. And I think it's what will be kind of the limiting factor in certain geographies. In another place, it may be transmission access or kind of the ability to build other grid infrastructure quickly. In others, it could be how willing the utility or the state regulators are to play ball and kind of entertain load growth of this scale. And so you're seeing a lot of like collision between like different values, different priorities, that kind of thing. And I think to answer like where you're seeing growth, specifically, I don't know if I have anything super unique to say here, but I think you're seeing a lot in Northern Virginia. I think you're seeing a lot in Texas. But really, I think to go one layer higher, I think you're seeing it in places where there are perceived or actual slack in the system, what that data centers can snap up. If there's a power plant that has interconnection rights that's going out of service, for example, and another plant can come quickly replace it, a data center may be keen to kind of come do that themselves. And so I think like it's an oversimplification to just say places like in Republican states, for example, that are easier to permit are like where data centers are going. It's not just like a red and blue issue. And so this is a little bit of like a wishy-washy answer, but I think it's hard to say. And beyond kind of the places you listed, Northern Virginia, Texas, it's really case by case and varies a ton. Because you're seeing like the example that is kind of near and dear to my heart right now is the Stratos data center in Utah. You're seeing there, one of the reasons they selected it is because there was surplus fiber capacity. There's, I guess, a fiber backbone going through this random part of the Utah desert. And that's really good for data centers, obviously, to have kind of low latency. And so anyways, I think in general, you should look at places where there's perceived or actual slack on the system. And that's where you're going to see data centers starting to look pretty keenly at developing.
Yeah, no, that's actually a great segue. As you mentioned, a lot of these developers are trying to find ways to kind of bypass some of these bottlenecks.
Totally.
So, for example, offering to curtail their loads during peak demand as a way to get access to interconnection queues faster in areas like ERCOT and PGIM, as you had talked about. How real is that as a solution in your mind?
Very real. And I think like I'll include broadly, like I think I was mentioning earlier how data center developers, AI companies are like gobbling up every good energy person, it feels like, in the world right now. There's a lot of great folks I worked with at DOE who are now working for the various hyperscalers or AI companies. And I think what they're doing that in part is because they're trying to find these creative workarounds to these processes. So I think examples you're seeing that are really creative are, one, data centers directly or hyperscalers directly funding generation kind of outside the normal grid process. So the example I'll use is Excel in Minnesota. They recently announced a deal. Google recently announced a deal with Form Energy, the long duration battery storage company, to bring online some new wind, some long duration energy storage, and essentially, I'm paraphrasing here, like offset the demand directly for their data center. And that's unique because normally the data center would just say, hey, I'm going to connect. Utility company, regulators, you figure it out how to give me power. I don't care what it is. And then when the generation comes online to meet that load and other load, it gets distributed across a bunch of different ratepayers, industrial facilities, residential folks like you and me. What's unique is that Google's essentially saying, hey, we're going to need the utility system. We want to be on the grid, but we will pay essentially directly to make sure there are no other costs being passed on to other consumers to bring online this clean electricity and use it to power our data center. And that ties into kind of the social license to operate thing I was mentioning, where it's like, it's kind of a win-win. You're getting jobs for the community, you're deploying novel clean energy tech, and you're getting a data center online. And that's kind of like a win for those. And maybe most importantly to me, you're making sure those costs aren't getting passed on to like everyday folks like you or me. And I think that's like kind of a win-win-win-win, 4 wins. And so that's one example. I think another example that's also really creative is you're seeing exploration of things like, depending on, this is a really state by state approach because there's just, the rules vary so much. You're seeing things in proposals where you say, hey, hyperscaler, if you want 100 megawatts of demand to come online, instead of you having to go procure it yourself or you having to kind of like go through this kind of interconnection process, what if you helped every home in that region become more energy efficient and you shave off 100 megawatts of demand that way? So rather than like the data center doing it, you're essentially helping people put in more efficient air conditioners or heat pumps, and reducing electricity load to kind of offset demand from the data center. Different states like count that efficiency increase in different ways, so it varies a ton. But you're seeing kind of interest in this type of model where it's like, it's easier to give like 20,000 people heat pumps sometimes than it is to go through the interconnection process. But I think it's very telling, and it's like a genuinely like very creative example that makes me optimistic about this in a sense, because again, you're providing direct benefits to like residential folks. You're helping people sometimes get access to AC that wouldn't otherwise have it. And you're helping them reduce their energy bills, and you get the data center online in kind of like a quick fashion without having to build new stuff needlessly. And so I think like broadly, there are things that you can be skeptical of with any of these like given flexibility approaches. But I think collectively, they're absolutely a real solution. And I'm curious to kind of see how far they push this model. There's probably stuff they're cooking up somewhere that I haven't even thought of. And I'm curious to see what it will be.
I agree. And what a statement. It's easier to get 20,000 folks heat pumps than to deal with the interconnection queues.
Yes.
Erik, last question for you. You've spent a number of years designing and implementing energy programs while at the DOE, and now you're actually on the ground thinking about energy infrastructure development and implementation. What's something you wish policymakers knew about what building in the real world actually requires?
I'll kind of give some context and then go into an answer. I was at the Department of Energy at a really interesting time. It was post implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and before kind of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was passed into law. I think one thing, I'll kind of reverse the question to start. So what should corporations and the public know about government? I think is how many bright, motivated people there are who want to make a difference on these issues. There's a lot of folks who have left the government in the last year and a half or so, who have gone on to do great things, but they were doing exceptional work on behalf of like the American taxpayer and the American people. And they were the kind of people I think you would, in your best ideal, would hope would be working for the federal government. And so I think it's worth like, we all hear about like, oh, lazy government bureaucrats and chair warmers, all that kind of stuff. And there certainly are some of those, I'm sure. But I think there's also a lot of bright people who are trying to kind of like make these creaky old systems sometimes work as well as they can to maximize impact. I think I would advise like corporations or others who are outside the government just try and see the federal government as a partner, and to like expect them to do a good job, if that makes sense. We should like, these are what our tax dollars are going to. If we have policies in place, this is literally what the government of the United States is saying that we want to do. We should ask them to like do it and do it well. And I think they'll rise to the challenge, and they often do. So I'll start there. Then maybe like flipping the script of like, what do policymakers and what do folks there need to know about, or what should corporations need to know about policymakers and vice versa? I think like policymakers need to be aware, that corporations are under a lot of pressure and are oftentimes operating in a very uncertain environment that's changing based on the rules, in a very heterodox environment, certainly at the state level. Rules vastly differ from state to state. The kind of like both formal processes of like how interconnection or NEPA permitting gets done is as varied as the informal kind of layers of power, who you need to know to kind of like, rub some shoulders and get a project approved or not approved. And I think federal policymakers need to have an awareness of how like federal policy gets implemented down at the state level or not implemented down, and how that's really the environment a lot of corporations are operating at. To make this a little more concrete, when you want to build an energy project, let's say a geothermal project somewhere in the Mountain West, the federal government, depending on where you are, it may be on federal land, and I'll kind of set that aside for now. But oftentimes you have to go through a state permitting office, a state kind of water rights office. And I think it's very easy to be in DC, which is where I am right now, and kind of like forget that like states are often the actors that are most directly in interfacing with corporations and are where they're seeing most of the benefits, right? Like governors compete for jobs and compete for projects because they want to bring it to their state. And I think one of the, I don't know if I want to call it a failure, but it was certainly one of the lessons learned from the Inflation Reduction Act is that like, if you're not thinking about making rules easy to follow and easy to implement from people downstream of the federal government, you may not get the uptake you want. I think it's a lesson for policymakers everywhere is, I think like efficiency and speed can sometimes be more advantageous than like optimal policy making. And I think that's like something to consider, and certainly a lesson I've taken from being at DOE, and that would go if I ever go back into federal service. What I'll certainly be thinking about is that like the classic phrase of like, you know, letting perfect be the enemy of the good. I think that applies in like, that's like a knob. And I think it's not just perfect enemy of good. It's also like mediocre. Don't let good or mediocre be like the enemy of like good, if that makes sense. Like do something is kind of what I'm getting at. It's better to do something than nothing, and simple is often better than overly complex, even if that's more optimal. I think corporations see that a lot. And I think one thing I'll kind of add to close is that I worked on a unique program that was essentially trying to help the Department of Energy better engage with startups and corporations that are wanting to move fast and don't necessarily have 2 or 3 years to negotiate a typical government award. And I think people raved about working with this program called the Partnership Intermediary Agreement, 3 organizations called EnergyWorks, TechWorks, and ConnectWorks. One of the things people enjoyed working with us on those programs about is that they enjoyed that it was quick, it was efficient. We gave them quick no's instead of long drawn out yeses. And I think a lot of times they were okay with those responses as long as it meant they weren't waiting and on the hook. If you're a startup, you may only have capital for 6 months or a year. You need kind of to move quickly. And sometimes these awards, these quick yeses or quick no's, can be more useful for them as long as the guidance is clear. And I think sometimes dealing with the federal government can be very opaque. And maybe this is the lesson, this is really where I'll close. The lesson I'd give to federal policymakers is that like, we should be more efficient and we should move faster and quicker to help kind of move at the speed of business.
And I think that was a perfect place to end it. Erik, thank you so much for all of your perspective today.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to chat with you.
Fantastic. And to our Dynamo Show listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave us a 5-star review and tell us what you liked. And be sure to head over to podcast.dynamo.vc to keep up to date with our latest content, or subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Until next time.